Imagine a coastline that no longer exists, a place where people once walked, hunted, gathered, and told stories under a sky unchanged in its stars but utterly transformed in its borders. Imagine a world where the ground beneath your feet extended far beyond what the waves allow today, a world of low plains, open marshes and long headlands that now sleep beneath the water. And then imagine that the memory of that world survives not in sediment cores or sonar maps, but in sentences, passed from voice to voice, across children who grew old and elders who became ancestors, for so many generations that the events they described shifted from lived experience into sacred inheritance. This is where we begin. What does it mean when a story outlives the land that first shaped it? In the southern Gulf of Carpentaria, the people of the Wellesley Islands tell of a time when their islands were not islands at all. The story says that the land was once a long peninsula attached to the mainland, a place where people moved freely across a solid ridge now drowned under the shallow sea. In the tale, the seagull woman drags her raft across the neck of the country, cutting a channel where none existed and letting the ocean spill through. Her motion divides the land. Her path becomes water. The world changes in a single sweep of her hand. To outside ears, this may sound like myth, but the details match the bathymetry almost exactly. The land bridge connecting the present-day islands to the mainland sits just below modern sea level. At the close of the last ice age, when seas stood far lower, those ridges were dry country. As the ice sheets melted and global waters rose, the Gulf filled. The timing aligns with reconstructions showing the sea reaching its modern height between 6 and 8 millennia ago. The story contains no numbers, no charts, no absolute dates. Yet its geography is correct. Its sequence of events is correct. Its memory, passed orally for thousands of years, outlasted the land it described. Along the southern coast of Australia, the Narangga people keep their own stories of drowning country. They speak of the time when Spencer Gulf was not a gulf at all, but a spread of marshy plains reaching into the interior. These plains held freshwater lagoons where emu and kangaroo gathered, where people moved across open ground that has long since fallen silent. One day the sea poured in, the barrier that held it broke, or perhaps it slowly overtopped the lowest parts of the land. Either way, what once was plain became water. The ancient shoreline lies today around 50 metres below the surface. For this to be remembered, the events must trace back more than 9 or 10 millennia. And like the stories from the Gulf of Carpentaria, the Narangga accounts describe their landscape with a precision that matches modern geophysical surveys. Each story is tied to places visible only through sonar and sediment samples. Each story maps a world that ended before writing existed anywhere on Earth. When linguists and geographers place these stories against reconstructions of changing shorelines, an unexpected harmony appears. The memories line up with coastlines as they were thousands of years ago. Islands remembered as hills, channels remembered as rivers, plains remembered as hunting grounds. 18 oral traditions from around the continent describe the same pattern. Land drowned by rising seas during the end of the Pleistocene, and not one story describes the opposite scenario. None say that land emerged from the sea, none tell of an ocean that retreated. They all remember a singular direction of change, a rising world, a slow swallowing. These are not narratives of invention or metaphorical transformation. They are accounts of inundation. They are history spoken in mythic vocabulary, but tied to real coastlines. And through them we witness something exceedingly rare. Knowledge carried intact across a span of time long enough to erase continents. The detail extends beyond physical description. Words tied to features now underwater persist in modern languages. Names of hills, lakes and hunting grounds survive, even though the places beneath them do not. In some regions, the linguistic distribution of terms traces the shape of prehistoric coastlines with a faithfulness similar to the way rivers preserve their old floodplains. Vocabulary, especially coastal vocabulary, tends to shift rapidly when people abandon or relocate from a region, but in Australia, the old terms remained stable, carried inland or upward as the seas advanced. They became fossils in sound, preserving the shape of vanished places. Meanwhile, the archaeological and paleoclimatic record fills in the rest. At the height of the last ice age around 20 millennia ago, global seas stood about 120 metres below present. As the climate warmed, ice melted. Oceans rose. By 13 millennia ago, seas were roughly 70 metres below modern levels. 1,000 years later, they were 50 metres below. These changes were not gentle. In some intervals, sea level rose several metres within a single human lifetime. Camps that had been safe for generations flooded. Familiar coastlines disappeared. Salt water entered estuaries and swept into low plains. For communities living along the edge of the continent, the world did not end at once. It ended piece by piece, shoreline by shoreline, over centuries, so slow that grandparents told their grandchildren that the sea was moving, and the children believed them because they saw it too. What some cultures would frame as apocalypse, Aboriginal traditions absorbed as continuity. The land changed, stories changed with it, but the core memory remained. Knowledge did not fracture or collapse. It adapted like the shoreline itself. For the people of the Great Barrier Reef region, memories survive of a time when Fitzroy Island was part of the mainland and when Green Island was 4 times larger. Elders recount that people walked where the sea now lies, moving across what is today submerged reef shelf. The story names places that no longer exist above water. Those names correspond to ridges and hollows now visible only through seafloor mapping. In other parts of the continent, traditions describe the shapes of drowned valleys and the routes ancestors took when the sea began rising. Listeners may ask whether such stories can truly survive for 10,000 years. Many scholars once doubted it, assuming oral memory collapses beyond a few centuries. But a pattern repeated across an entire continent tells a different story. When stories from regions separated by thousands of kilometres, from cultures that have not shared language for tens of millennia, all describe the same type of event with locally accurate detail, coincidence becomes unlikely. These accounts reflect observation. The sea rose. People witnessed it. They spoke of it. Their descendants kept speaking of it. And across a span longer than the existence of agriculture in many parts of the world, the words remained. What becomes clear in this evidence is that the first sign of endurance in Aboriginal Australia is not the genetic continuity, though that too is remarkable. It is the narrative continuity, a robustness of story that bridges millennia, a capacity for collective memory that outlives geography, a cultural scaffolding strong enough that knowledge can pass from one generation to the next without collapsing under the weight of time. This does not mean that every detail remains unchanged. Stories evolve, they respond to new environments, new pressures, but their core truths persist. The drowning of a land bridge, the loss of marshes, the reshaping of coasts, the transformation of the familiar into the submerged, and so the geology becomes confirmation. Modern sea level curves, fossil shorelines, and subsurface topography lend physical support to tales carried by ancestors who had no maps, no satellites, no written records. Their knowledge came from observation passed collectively, renewed in ceremony and retold where the land itself acted as mnemonic guide. When stories anchor themselves to place, place becomes the memory. And when place disappears, the memory remains, floating above the water like the name of a hill long drowned. If endurance is the measure of a culture, then the survival of these oral histories is the first proof that we are dealing with something rare. Here, the past has not faded. It has been repeated for so long, and with such care, that it has become almost geological in its stability. We do not know for certain how the earliest versions of these stories sounded. We do not know how many storytellers altered their phrasing or added texture that helped listeners understand a world none had seen. But the evidence suggests that the essential shape has held, and what other cultures attempted to preserve through carved stones or written tablets, Aboriginal Australians kept alive in breath alone. The story outlived the shoreline, the memory survived the sea. To understand how such memory survived, we must step inward, toward the world it preserved. All right, hello fellow sapiens, sit back, relax, and prepare to wander into a story older than almost anything we can name, the most ancient living culture on Earth, and why this story has endured 50,000 years. Tonight, we move slowly, like time itself, through deep memory, quiet landscapes, and the traces left by ancestors who never stopped speaking through their land. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science, slow storytelling, and late-night archaeology for tired thinkers who want the world explained gently. No rush, no noise, just deep time and quiet curiosity. Imagine this. A world where time does not move forward like an arrow, but settles around you like a quiet fog. A world where the past is not something behind you, the present is not something you stand inside, and the future is not something waiting ahead. Instead, everything exists at once, layered through landforms, stories, ancestors, and obligations. Picture yourself standing on warm red ground as the light softens, listening to someone older than your memory telling you not just how the world began, but why it continues, and how every step you take presses against the footsteps of beings who shaped the earth long before anyone you know was born. Now imagine that this worldview remains almost unchanged while ice ages end, coastlines drown, climates shift, and entire species vanish. How does a worldview remain steady when the world around it transforms? The answer lies in what Aboriginal Australians call the dreaming. We do not know for certain how old the dreaming is, but the evidence suggests that it is not merely a cosmology or a mythic archive. It is a living system that ties together land, ancestry, law, and time with a coherence that has no exact parallel elsewhere. The stories that explain how a hill rose, how a river curved, or how a species came to inhabit a place are not decorative tales. They are instruments of knowledge. They define moral expectations, map kinship networks, describe obligations to the land, and root each person in a history that is both mythic and literal. For the people who inherit it, the dreaming is not a distant age. It is not a golden past. It is a present that contains everything. And for a culture to endure across 50 millennia, something like that must be in place. When elders speak of the dreaming, they describe a time before time when ancestral beings moved through a shapeless world. Some travelled as people, some as animals, some in forms that blur the distinctions between the two. Their journeys left marks on the ground. A bend in a creek follows the body of a great serpent. A ridge mirrors the resting place of a kangaroo ancestor. A chain of waterholes records the footprints of a hero who crossed the land seeking others of his kind. These are not metaphors. They are explanations connecting people to the world that holds them. Archaeologists studying the distribution of these sacred landscapes note that the paths described in oral accounts often correspond to natural geological features, fault lines, basalt flows, and ancient watercourses. Knowledge encoded in narrative mirrors features visible to anyone who walks the land. Because the land is an archive, the story remains stable, and because the story remains stable, the land becomes intelligible. It is this reciprocal structure that creates a worldview capable of outlasting changing climates, rising seas, and the movement of species. This system of meaning holds because it binds origins and obligations together. Each story has a moral dimension. Some describe how certain animals came to be hunted in particular ways, or why certain plants must be gathered only by particular groups. Others define how marriages are arranged, who can speak certain names, or what songs must be performed at specific places. These obligations shape kinship in ways that extend far beyond family. They create networks of responsibility that hold communities together and regulate social conduct without courts or written laws. A person inherits not only their biological ancestry, but a set of totemic ties. These ties determine what foods they can eat, which animals they are responsible for protecting, and what rituals they must participate in. They're born into a web of relationships that stretch across families, species, and landscapes. And so the dreaming is not simply a record of events. It is a structure that explains why people belong where they do and what they owe to one another. What makes it even more unusual is its treatment of time. In most cultures, the past is viewed as something completed, the present as something lived, and the future as something anticipated. In the dreaming, these distinctions blur. Elders often describe the events of the dreaming as happening now, continually, their influence unfolding in each moment. Scholars sometimes use the term everywhen to describe this. It is not an attempt to mystify the system, but to capture the fact that dreaming stories are not simply about origin. They're about continuity. The actions of ancestral beings are active in the present. When ceremonies reenact their journeys, they are not commemorating the past. They are participating in ongoing creation. Time in this worldview is not a line, it is a field. Continuity is maintained not by freezing the past, but by keeping it close, allowing each generation to access it. This perception of time reinforces accuracy. A story does not drift into abstraction because it is regularly renewed. Corrections are made through ceremonial instruction. Knowledge is tied to responsibilities. Stories are not retold for entertainment, but for maintaining the balance between people and the land. Modern linguistic studies show that these oral traditions often remain remarkably stable. Certain song cycles in northern Australia contain structural patterns that have changed little for centuries, possibly millennia. The precision comes not from rigid memorization, but from the fact that each performance is guided by place. A story told at a waterhole follows a specific form because the land demands it. Knowledge tied to landscape resists alteration. If the storyteller misremembers a detail about a hill, the hill itself corrects it. Oral knowledge reinforced by geography becomes durable. It can survive the collapse of villages, migrations, or disruptions caused by external forces. Even where communities were displaced in recent centuries, older people still navigated back to sacred sites, guided by memory and story. In this way, the dreaming functions almost like a living physics, a system where the rules of existence do not need written articulation, because they are continually present in landforms, ceremonies, and stories. Landforms reflect the actions of ancestral beings. Ancestral beings establish the laws. The laws determine social obligations regulate behaviour, and behaviour maintains the world. It is a closed and coherent system. A culture does not need to rebuild itself after environmental change because the structure that keeps it intact is not external, it is internal and relational. This is why the dreaming remained stable even as the world around it changed dramatically. When the coastline shifted at the end of the last ice age, the paths of ancestral beings simply extended underwater. Stories recording those movements persisted because the principles behind them did not require revision. When climate changed again in later periods, ceremonies adjusted but did not lose their core function. Continuity did not depend on external stability. It depended on a logic of belonging that incorporated change without fracture. A worldview like this does not prevent hardship or disappearance, but it does provide a framework resilient enough to survive disruptions that would dissolve other systems. Archaeologists who study long-term cultural continuity often note that societies rooted in landscape-based cosmologies retain stability longer than those dependent on written records alone. Writing preserves content, but not context. Oral traditions tied to place preserve both. When the land remains the teacher, knowledge moves one generation at a time without losing coherence. And even when people are displaced or fragmented, the stories that shape their world continue to guide them back. For Aboriginal Australia, the dreaming is not merely the oldest surviving cosmology on Earth. It is a system that demonstrates what cultural endurance can look like when memory is relational rather than chronological. The truths it preserves do not depend on dates or historical markers, but on responsibilities. A culture survives because its truths are not anchored in dates but in relationships, a physics of belonging that binds people to each other and to the world they inhabit. But stories alone cannot endure unless anchored to something we can touch. If you enjoy learning this way, calmly, without pressure, consider tapping like or subscribe. It helps other sleepless minds find their way here. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? In bed? Driving home? Working with headphones on? I always love knowing how these stories travel. And if you drift off along the way, don't worry. There are timestamps below so you can find your path again when you wake. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Picture a moment when the only written surface was stone, and the only ink was dust lifted from the earth. Imagine a people who did not carve words, yet still found a way to leave themselves behind, not through sentences but through presence. When we look at the oldest art on the Australian continent, we're not looking at decoration. We are looking at the closest thing these early communities had to memory fixed in place. And the question becomes almost unsettling in its simplicity. What do images reveal about people who left no written script? If we listen to them quietly, without trying to make them more literal than they are, they begin to speak in the way old landscapes speak. Slowly, but with authority earned through time. Archaeology suggests that some of the earliest known figures, the delicate Gwion paintings of the Kimberley region, emerged around 20 millennia ago. They are not static sketches. They show thin, elongated human forms in motion, with tassels, sashes and feathered ornaments that hint at ritual and ceremony rather than everyday life. Their lines are fine and purposeful, suggesting a level of technique that was already mature the moment it appeared in the archaeological record. We do not know who painted them. We do not know the names of their communities. But we do know that the style persisted long enough that it became something like a signature for the people who lived there. Paleochemical analysis shows that some of these figures were repainted repeatedly by later generations, as if renewing the presence of those who first placed them there. It is not writing, at least not in the way a modern scholar would define the term, but it is continuity, and perhaps continuity is another form of text. As time passed, new artistic systems emerged without erasing what came before. In the rock shelters of Arnhem Land, the so-called X-ray artworks began to appear several millennia after the Gwion figures, depicting fish, turtles and other animals with internal organs clearly visible. This was not an anatomical diagram in the modern sense. Rather, it reflected a cosmological understanding in which the spiritual essence of a being could be shown through the showing of its interior. Archaeologists note that the bones and organs are depicted with accuracy, yet the purpose was likely not scientific instruction for its own sake. It seems more closely connected to the idea that everything in the natural world carries an inner force, and perhaps the best way to honour it is to reveal it. These images suggest an attention to detail, to observation, and to the invisible structure of life that we can still recognise today. In other regions, the most common marks are hand stencils. A person pressed their palm against a rock face and blew pigment over it, leaving behind a negative imprint that could last for tens of thousands of years. Some caves contain hundreds of these outlines, layered one over another, forming a kind of ancestral roster. It is tempting to imagine them as signatures, but that may be too individualistic a reading. Many scholars think the hand stencils were a way of marking belonging. To place one's hand among the hands of earlier people was to announce a connection to that place, not merely to its inhabitants, but to its entire history. The simple outline becomes something like a vow, renewed with each generation. Far to the west lies Murujuga, sometimes called the Dampier Archipelago, one of the largest concentrations of petroglyphs anywhere on Earth. More than 1 million carvings cover its rock surfaces, created over a period so long that the earliest could be more than 30 millennia old. The images vary widely. Animals now extinct, geometric patterns, human figures in various poses, and abstract forms whose meanings remain elusive. Unlike the painted shelters of the north, these petroglyphs were created by pecking or abrading the rock surface, which takes both skill and persistence. Some figures have been darkened by desert varnish, indicating immense age. Others remain lighter, suggesting renewal long after their initial creation. Murujuga functions as something between a gallery and an archive, a record of shifting ecosystems and cultural expressions woven into the same landscape. Among the most striking images across these regions are depictions of megafauna. Some rock art shows animals that vanished more than 40 millennia ago, including giant kangaroos and the large flightless bird Genyornis. When an artist depicts a creature that no longer exists, we gain not just an artistic reference but a chronological one. These images become timestamps, placing human presence and observation within ecosystems that later disappeared. Archaeology gains not only evidence of artistic expression, but evidence of a world that human beings witnessed and recorded before it faded. Taken together, these forms of art do not compose a single narrative. They are not chapters of one book. Instead, they form a distributed archive that stretches across the continent and across extraordinary lengths of time. The continuity is not in the specific motifs, but in the commitment to marking experience in stone. When scholars examine this material, the silence behind the images is as important as the images themselves. Without written languages, we rely on style, pigment, composition, and context to trace change through time. And what stands out is how long these artistic traditions persisted, modified gently across millennia without abrupt disruption. If we compare this to regions where agriculture or large cities developed, the contrast is striking. Elsewhere, artistic systems change rapidly as populations shift or technologies spread. In Australia, the land held people in place long enough that they created a remarkably stable visual tradition. The more we look, the more the walls become something other than decoration. They become a form of memory storage. They hold observations of landscapes that no longer exist, animals that no longer walk these plains, patterns of kinship and belief fixed in pigment and stone. And through this lens, we begin to see why some anthropologists describe the continent itself as an archive. Each shelter, each cliff face, each engraved surface participates in a long, slow construction of cultural continuity. We do not know for certain how these images were used in daily life. We do not know whether the makers thought of themselves as preserving anything for the future. But the evidence suggests they were part of a system in which history, identity, and landscape were inseparable. This is why these sites matter. They remind us that some cultures do not express themselves through the rapid accumulation of monuments or written documents. Instead, they express themselves through repetition across generations, through attention to the same shelters and the same stone surfaces, through observation carried out slowly and recorded in ways that last longer than paper ever will. These images survived because they were placed where nothing could easily erase them, and because the people who lived among them treated those places as part of their social world. And so, the art becomes a form of timekeeping, a way of sensing how long a community has existed in one place. Art survives, but how did the people who made it survive the land? If we step further into these landscapes, another dimension of the artwork becomes clear. It's not simply that images were made, but that their placement followed an internal logic. Many shelters show a deliberate ordering of figures, with certain motifs always occupying higher positions on the wall, while others cluster near the ground. Archaeologists studying these vertical patterns have noted that figures associated with ancestral beings tend to appear near ceilings or high ledges, where the rock seems to touch the sky. Everyday animals or practical scenes, by contrast, often reside lower on the panel. This arrangement suggests a visual hierarchy, not written, but understood, in which cosmological meaning is woven into the geometry of stone. We do not know for certain how consistently this rule was applied, but the recurrence across distant regions implies a shared grammar of placement long before the arrival of written languages. Another subtlety emerges in the pigments themselves. When researchers analyse microscopic traces from ancient paintings, they find an unexpected mixture of mineral and organic components. Ochre provides the colour, but binders sometimes include plant resins or even traces of blood proteins. These materials would have required deliberate preparation. Minerals needed to be ground, mixed, heated, or carried from distant sources. Some quarries show evidence of long-term extraction, suggesting that specific pigments held social or ritual importance. It tells us that painting was not a casual act. It was a practice that depended on mobility, planning, and collaboration. Even the act of refreshing a figure centuries later required the same knowledge of pigments, indicating that technical skills were transmitted carefully within communities. In places where the paintings remain faint or heavily weathered, other clues have been found in the surrounding deposits. Small clusters of stone flakes lie beneath certain panels, hinting that tools were shaped or retouched during the creation of images. Grinding stones used to prepare ochre have been found tucked into cracks in the rock, perhaps left intentionally for future painters. These objects act like footnotes preserved by accident. They deepen our understanding not by showing us the finished art, but by revealing the quiet processes behind it, the gestures and preparations that rarely survive in the material record. Then there is the question of illumination. Many painted shelters extend deep into narrow chambers where natural light barely reaches. Archaeologists examining soot deposits have identified signs of controlled fires used not for warmth, but for visibility. These burn marks and charcoal flecks appear at consistent heights, suggesting that firelight was positioned intentionally to reveal certain figures while leaving others in shadow. The flicker of flame against painted walls would have transformed these spaces into moving surfaces, where images seem to shift and breathe. Even if we cannot reconstruct the exact rituals that took place here, the interplay of the light and pigment indicates that the art was not meant to be viewed passively. It was activated by presence, by movement, by the simple act of bringing fire into darkness. All of this helps us see the ancient artists not as anonymous painters, but as practitioners of a complex tradition. Their work required knowledge of minerals, stone surfaces, pigments, quarry sources, and the behaviour of fire. It required memory of the proper order in which figures should appear, and understanding of the places where stories were meant to be anchored. And when thousands of years passed, each new hand that added to these walls participated in a dialogue that we can still witness today, long after the voices themselves have vanished. Would you like this continuation woven into the final merge segment, or kept as an add-on for now? Picture a moment when survival did not depend on overwhelming the land, but on understanding it so precisely that even fire could become a tool of balance. Imagine walking across a continent so vast that its climates shift from monsoon rainforests to cold highlands to deserts where the horizon wavers with heat. In most places on Earth, such variety forces cultures to fracture, adapt, and transform rapidly. Yet here, across landscapes that seem designed to push people apart, a remarkable continuity persisted. The question becomes simple, but immense. How did a continent so vast sustain cultures so stable? Archaeology suggests that the answer begins with a different kind of environmental mastery, one rooted not in the transformation of the land for human benefit alone, but in shaping ecosystems to remain predictable. In many parts of the world, large-scale change arrives with agriculture, with the clearing of forests for fields, with new domesticated species, with surpluses and hierarchies. But in ancient Australia, the evidence points toward a quieter intervention. Firestick farming, as early European observers later called it, was not farming in the agricultural sense. It was a controlled system of burning that moved across the landscape like a slow pulse, clearing underbrush, opening pathways and renewing plant communities. The result was a mosaic of habitats at different stages of regrowth, attractive to game species that relied on fresh shoots. The burns were intentional, patterned, and timed to specific seasons. We do not know for certain how long these practices existed, but sediment cores show fire signatures consistent with regular burning extending well before the arrival of agriculture elsewhere. What researchers now understand is that these controlled fires reduce the risk of massive, uncontrollable wildfires by preventing fuel accumulation. They encourage species that thrived in post-burn environments, especially kangaroos and other grazing animals. The burns also cleared pathways for travel and facilitated access to resources. Early accounts from European settlers describe landscapes resembling open parklands, though they did not realise these were curated spaces, shaped by millennia of practice rather than untouched wilderness. The stability these burns created did not eliminate scarcity, but it moderated it, smoothing out the extremes of drought and overgrowth. Beyond fire, another element of environmental knowledge emerges in the archaeological and ethnographic record. Water-finding techniques were embedded not in maps but in oral traditions and songlines. These songlines, which follow routes across deserts, plains and coasts, describe not only the movements of ancestral beings, but also the location of waterholes, seasonal creeks, and subterranean sources. Some of these water points are so subtle that modern hydrologists rely on elders' descriptions to find them. The knowledge embedded in these narratives is not metaphorical. It is functional. It tells where to dig, how deep, and what plants signal the presence of underground moisture. It shows how to navigate a land that at times hides its water with deliberate indifference. plant use reveals another layer of adaptation. Many native species contain toxins that must be removed through leaching, heating, or fermentation. Archaeobotanical evidence shows that these techniques were mastered early. Grinding stones from sites across the continent display residues from plants that are not edible without careful preparation. Communities timed their harvest to the seasons when toxins were lowest and used methods that neutralized the rest. This required not only observation but coordination. Certain foods could not be prepared individually. They required collective labour, gathering materials from multiple locations, and knowledge of the proper sequence in which roots, seeds, or fruits should be treated. Seasonal movements were another dimension of stability. Instead of permanent settlements that exhausted local resources, many groups practiced rotational occupancy, returning to the same campsites at the same times each year. Archaeological layers show periodic reoccupation rather than intensifying extraction. These cycles mirrored the rhythms of the land. When rains arrived, people moved toward regions where plant foods flourished. When the dry season returned, they followed animal migrations or shifted to areas with reliable shelter. The system depends on predictability, but also on restraint. Communities did not remain in one place long enough to deplete it beyond recovery, and their movement patterns were shaped by long-term observation passed across generations. One of the most striking aspects of this environmental knowledge is that it remained effective for millennia, without leading to the ecological collapse often seen in other regions. There were no massive deforestation events, no salinized fields, no abandoned cities overtaken by erosion. It is not that ancient Australians lacked the capacity to transform landscapes, it is that they transformed them in ways that kept them stable. Fire stick practices, water-finding traditions, plant detoxification methods, and seasonal cycles created a system in which the land remained capable of supporting human life without major crises. Archaeology reveals long-term continuity in occupation sites, suggesting that communities returned year after year without exhausting local resources. This pattern stands in contrast to regions where agriculture created sudden population booms, followed by equally rapid declines. We do not know for certain whether these practices developed gradually or emerged from a long series of experiments. What the evidence suggests is that they were refined across generations through careful observation. Mistakes would have been costly. A burn set at the wrong moment could extinguish food sources for months. A waterhole overused could collapse the fragile balance of desert survival. Yet the continuity of these methods indicates a system that worked more often than it failed. Stability came not from domination of the landscape, but from participation in its rhythms. The land was not an adversary to be conquered, but a partner whose cycles could be aligned with human needs. This partnership appears in subtle signs across the continent. In some regions, archaeologists have identified ancient fish traps, constructed from stone arranged to guide fish into shallows where they could be captured efficiently. These structures required knowledge of tides, river flows, and fish behaviour. They represent interventions that enhance abundance rather than deplete it. In other regions, evidence of storage pits and carefully managed yam fields shows that plant resources were sometimes encouraged to grow in predictable patterns without crossing into full-scale agriculture. It is a form of management that increases reliability without introducing the vulnerabilities of monoculture. Taken together, these practices form a picture of a continent shaped not by the heavy hand of agricultural expansion, but by a lighter one. The land was burned but not cleared, harvested but not stripped, travelled but not carved into rigid boundaries. Water was found through story, plants through ritual, animals through cycles, and the systems endured, passing through droughts, climate shifts, and even the arrival of the Holocene without collapsing. They speak to a form of resilience rooted not in accumulation but in equilibrium. But partnership alone cannot explain genetic endurance. What becomes clearer the longer we study these systems is that knowledge was not scattered randomly among individuals. It travelled along well-defined channels, encoded in responsibilities that extended far beyond personal survival. Certain families held detailed understanding of local plant cycles, while others specialised in reading animal behaviour or the subtle atmospheric changes that signalled seasonal transitions. Archaeological traces of this specialisation appear in tool distributions and in the spatial layout of long-used campsites. Areas dedicated to plant processing lie consistently apart from places associated with hunting preparation or ceremonial activity. These divisions are modest in scale, yet precise in their recurrence, hinting at social structures designed to preserve ecological skills across generations. Another layer of this mastery can be seen in the way early communities shaped microenvironments that enhanced resilience. Along river systems, archaeologists have identified shallow earthworks arranged to slow water flow during the wet season, allowing sediments to settle and small pools to persist deep into the dry months. These features are easy to overlook, blending into the landscape so completely that only careful excavation reveals them. They do not represent agriculture in the traditional sense. Instead, they operate like subtle interventions intended to extend the usefulness of natural cycles. In regions with unpredictable rainfall, such modifications could mean the difference between scarcity and stability. In coastal zones, a parallel story unfolds. Shell middens, some spanning thousands of years of deposition, reveal not only diets but patterns of selective harvesting. Certain species appear at consistent sizes across long periods, suggesting that people took what ecosystems could replenish, rather than exhausting available resources. Some middens show deliberate layering of different shell types, hinting at seasonal cycles of collection guided by lunar and tidal rhythms. These are not the leftovers of opportunistic foraging. They record a disciplined practice of extraction shaped by rules that kept coastal zones productive over immense spans of time. Even mobility across the interior appears far more structured than early European observers realized. Studies of stone artifact distributions show that people transported particular raw materials across immense distances, not randomly, but along predictable pathways. This implies that travel routes were maintained with care, shared between groups and kept open through regular use. The circulation of stone, resin, and ochre reveals a continent threaded with exchange, long before metal tools or pack animals existed. These networks relied not on large populations, but on the endurance of shared expectations about where people could travel, where they could camp, and how resources were to be treated along the way. Such patterns point toward a form of environmental governance that did not rely on centralized authority. Instead, it emerged from consensus and adherence to long-standing customs. Archaeological evidence rarely preserves the conversations that shape these decisions, yet the results endure in the landscape itself. A continent as varied and demanding as Australia could have fractured communities into isolated pockets. But what we see instead is a steady accumulation of wisdom that kept landscapes habitable without exhausting them. This kind of stability is not accidental. It reflects an ecological intelligence calibrated to a world where reliability had to be earned slowly, through attention rather than force. Imagine a moment when the horizon was no longer a boundary but an invitation. Picture a shoreline tens of thousands of years ago, where the sea was lower, the winds carried a colder breath, and distant islands rose like muted shapes against the morning light. To stand there was to stand at the literal edge of the known world, and yet someone stepped forward. not just once, not by accident, but in repeated journeys that would move an entire population across a chain of islands toward a land no human had ever seen. The question that lingers softly but insistently is why this migration was unlike any other in human prehistory. The evidence does not show a people pushed by crisis or pulled by wealth. It shows deliberate travel, purposeful movement, and a willingness to cross water wider and more unpredictable than anything their ancestors had ever encountered. Archaeology suggests that reaching Sahul, the ancient continent comprising present-day Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, required skill beyond simple coastal wandering. During the late Pleistocene, sea levels were significantly lower than today, exposing vast stretches of land, broadening coastlines, and revealing platforms that modern maps hide beneath water. Even so, the region between Southeast Asia and Sahul was never fully connected. The deep ocean trenches that form the Wallace Line remained a barrier no matter how far the seas receded. This line marks a natural boundary between ecosystems, but for early humans it represented something far more immediate. It was the point where land disappeared entirely and open sea demanded navigation, planning and cooperation. We do not know for certain what kinds of watercraft they used. The archaeological record is silent on wood and fibre, but by examining the geography and the distances between islands, researchers have demonstrated that the crossings could not have been accidental. Wind patterns push rafts back toward Asia rather than outward. Currents do the same. To move across them would have required a craft capable of forward momentum and a group that knew when conditions were favourable. The dates of arrival remain one of the great debates in Australian archaeology, yet the broad range is clear. Conservative estimates place the first successful settlement around 50 to 55 millennia ago, a timeline supported by many mainland sites. The upper bound stretches to 65 millennia, with Madjed Bebe in northern Australia offering some of the earliest evidence of human presence. Excavations there reveal stone tools, ochre fragments, and hearth remains buried beneath layers of sediment that have accumulated across tens of thousands of years. Luminescence dating results suggest occupation that may reach deep into this earlier window. Scholars are careful to note the uncertainties involved in any method that measures the last time minerals were exposed to sunlight, yet the consistency of the dates across multiple samples lends weight to the interpretation. These findings place humans in Sahul long before the end of the last glacial cycle, at a time when much of the world was still adjusting to the new dispersals of Homo sapiens across Asia. The significance of these early dates becomes clearer when viewed alongside ecological modelling. If a founding population reached Sahul 50 millennia ago, even in modest numbers, simulations show that humans could have spread across the entire continent within a few thousand years. The models incorporate terrain difficulty, water availability, and typical foraging ranges. They suggest that once the initial crossings occurred, movement would have been steady and rapid, not because the people were racing across the land, but because the population grew, divided, and sought new regions that could support small groups. This was not a sprint. It was a slow outward breathing, a gradual expansion guided by the landscape itself. Archaeological traces from the south, dating between 40 and 50 millennia ago, support this scenario. They show that early communities reached arid zones, temperate forests and coastal plains within a surprisingly short window of time. The more closely we examine the evidence, the harder it becomes to imagine these first arrivals as castaways blown off course. The distances between islands in the Wallacea region may appear small on a modern map, but even when sea levels were low, the gaps between land masses would have required the crossings of many kilometres. The larger stretches of open water are estimated to have spanned between 10 and 20 kilometres in width. These are not distances a drifting raft could reliably traverse. Oceanographers studying current flows in the region note that passive drift tends to move vessels either back toward continental shelves or into wide dispersing patterns that would strand travellers far from resources. To cross intentionally is the simplest explanation. This does not require modern instruments. It requires only repeated observation of tides, wind, and the movement of birds. It requires remembering which islands lie just beyond sight and where the sun aligns with the path of travel. The competence required is quiet but profound. Other clues come from lithic technology. Stone tool assemblages from early Sahul sites show continuity with Southeast Asian traditions, yet display unique adaptations almost immediately upon arrival. This suggests that multiple attempts were likely made to cross the region. Successful settlement required not just reaching new land, but sustaining life there long enough for a population to grow. Once communities established themselves, they developed toolkits suited to local environments, whether tropical forests in the north or drier open plains in the interior. The rapid diversification of tool types indicates that the people who arrived did so with an existing capacity for flexibility. This capacity, combined with deliberate navigation, paints a picture of humans who are already experienced travellers. What makes this migration stand apart from others in deep time is context. In other regions, the movement of early humans often followed coastlines, rivers, or mountain corridors. These routes provided continuous resources and did not require major breaks in terrain. The crossing into Sahul broke that pattern. It demanded trust in an unseen destination. It required cooperation among groups large enough to build, launch, and control a vessel. It also needed some form of knowledge transfer so that each attempt could refine what had been learned. Archaeologists analysing demographic models argue that a single successful crossing may not have been enough to establish a viable population. Instead, repeated crossings, perhaps over centuries, could have introduced enough genetic diversity to support long-term survival. This interpretation fits the evidence from genetic studies showing stable lineages extending deep into the past. We do not know what motivated these early navigators. The archaeological record does not preserve intention, yet we can say that they were not merely driven by scarcity. Many regions in Southeast Asia during this time offered abundant resources. The movement towards Sahul seems less like an escape and more like an expansion grounded in curiosity, exploration, or social dynamics we cannot fully reconstruct. This does not romanticize the people involved. It simply recognizes that migration in deep time often reflects complex pressures, some practical and some cultural. In this case, the decision to cross water created a lineage unlike any other. The relative isolation of Sahul meant that once established, its people would diverge genetically from other populations, carrying with them traces of their ancestors, while developing paths distinct from those unfolding elsewhere across the continents. In this sense, the first crossing represents a moment when humans chose a direction no one had tested. The act was quiet. No records mark the event. No carvings commemorate it. Yet the consequences radiate outward across tens of thousands of years of cultural and biological history. It is a reminder that human ingenuity does not always announce itself through dramatic inventions or monumental architecture. Sometimes it appears in the simple fact that someone saw a distant island and believed it could be reached, and then they reached it. Those early choices shaped a lineage unlike any other. Imagine standing in a place long enough that the land begins to remember you. Picture a lineage rooted so deeply that the soil, the wind patterns, the shifting constellations overhead have all changed many times, yet the people beneath them have remained. Most human populations carry the traces of countless movements, admixtures, disruptions and replacements. But here, on a continent separated by deep ocean trenches and glacial seas, a different kind of story unfolded. What happens when a people stay in one land for tens of millennia, long after the rest of the world has reshaped itself through migrations, collapses, and expansions? Genetics, in its quiet and often mathematical language, gives us one of the clearest answers we have. It reveals a continuity so profound that it stretches nearly to the beginning of the human journey beyond Africa, preserving signals most populations lost long ago in the turbulence of later history. When researchers first began sequencing Aboriginal Australian genomes in the early 21st century, they expected to see layers of mixing with later arrivals from Asia, as had happened across most of the world. Instead, they found something startling. The divergence between Aboriginal Australian ancestors and other non-African populations appears extraordinarily early, estimated by coalescent models to have occurred around 50 millennia ago, shortly after the first major dispersal of modern humans out of Africa. In some models, the split occurs even earlier, with certain genome-wide comparisons pushing the separation toward the upper limits of the timeline for the earlier Sahul settlement. These estimates vary depending on the mutation rates and demographic priors used, but the pattern is always the same. Aboriginal lineages branch off near the root of the non-African tree, holding a position close to the earliest expansions into Asia. This is not a symbolic phrase. In QP graph analyses, where populations are placed into models of divergence and mixture, Aboriginal Australians frequently anchor one of the oldest surviving non-African basal nodes. This deep separation is further supported by mitochondrial DNA studies. The vast majority of Aboriginal Australian mtDNA lineages fall within macrohaplogroup M, a deep branch linked to early coastal dispersals through southern Asia. Within Australia, researchers identify several unique sublineages such as haplogroups S and P, which appear to have diversified within the continent tens of thousands of years ago. These lineages do not show signs of later replacement. Instead, they display long genealogies, with coalescence estimates stretching far back into the late Pleistocene. This means that maternal lines found in Australia today trace their ancestry to women who lived in Sahul, when glaciers still dominated the northern hemisphere and megafauna roamed across the continent. Y chromosome data shows a parallel story. Haplogroups such as CM130 and KM9 derivatives, including branches like S1 and M14, appear to have ancient roots in Sahul and nearby regions. Some of these lineages are found exclusively in Australia and parts of New Guinea, showing divergence patterns that cannot be explained by recent movements. Their phylogenies reveal long internal branches, consistent with extended periods of in situ evolution, rather than later influx from mainland Asia. In demographic models, the combination of unique Y chromosome and mtDNA signatures produces a picture of a population that has been genetically distinct for an extraordinarily long time. One of the most intriguing findings comes from ancient DNA recovered from remains near Willandra Lakes, dated to more than 40,000 years ago. Although the preservation of nuclear DNA is extremely poor in the hot and variable climates of Australia, mitochondrial DNA from these early individuals has been sequenced. These sequences do not match modern lineages perfectly. They belong to deep branches that appear to have no surviving descendants today. This indicates a pattern consistent with long-term regional diversification. In other words, by 40 millennia ago, distinct lineages were already present within Sahul, and some of these early branches later disappeared while others survived. This pattern mirrors what we see in Europe and Asia, where ancient populations contributed only partially to modern gene pools. But the difference in Australia is continuity. Where Europe shows repeated population turnovers, the ancient genetic signal in Sahul remains fundamentally aligned with the modern one. Genome-wide analyses further illuminate this continuity. When researchers apply principal component analysis to Aboriginal genomes, individuals cluster strongly by region. People from the Kimberley region cluster together, those from Arnhem Land form another group, and communities from the desert interior create yet another. These patterns reflect structures that have persisted for tens of thousands of years. Coalescent simulations and statistics indicate that major regional differentiation within Sahul was already established by approximately 30 millennia ago. This means that as ice sheets reach their maximum extent in other parts of the world, shaping human movements across Europe and Asia, Aboriginal communities were already deeply rooted in specific landscapes within the continent. Later climatic fluctuations did not erase these structures. They only reinforced them as populations adapted to local environments through long-term stability. Another key component of Aboriginal genetic history involves Denisovan ancestry. Genomic studies show that Aboriginal Australians and Papuans carry Denisovan-derived genetic segments not found in the same proportions elsewhere in the world. These segments reflect an ancient admixture event, likely in parts of Southeast Asia, before the ancestors of Sahul populations diverged from other groups. The exact timing remains debated, but statistical modelling suggests that this Denisovan contribution is distinct from the Denisovan ancestry found in East Asian populations. Some models even indicate multiple waves of Denisovan introgression into ancestors of Sahul settlers. This introduces a complexity that researchers are still trying to resolve. What is clear, however, is that the Denisovan signal forms part of a unique genetic signature that further distinguishes Aboriginal Australians from other early non-African lineages. The relationship between Aboriginal Australians and Papuans provides another layer of insight. Genetic evidence suggests a long-standing connection between the two populations, reflecting shared ancestry from the original settlers of Sahul. Yet QP-Graph and a demixture modelling show that the Papuan-Australian split began long before rising sea levels physically separated New Guinea from Australia at the end of the last glacial period. This indicates that population structure emerged not because of oceanic barriers, but through cultural and ecological divergence within a still-connected continent. The subsequent flooding that created the Torres Strait only reinforced divisions that had already formed over thousands of years. Even so, the shared ancestry between Papuans and Aboriginal Australians remains one of the oldest continuous population relationships documented anywhere in the world. Genome-wide diversity studies reveal further evidence for this continuity. Aboriginal Australians show levels of heterozygosity consistent with long-term stable population sizes, punctuated by local fluctuations but lacking the large-scale bottlenecks common in many other early human histories. This stability aligns with archaeological evidence for long-term habitation at multiple sites across the continent. It also matches patterns from experimental demographic models that show how small, regionally distributed populations could maintain genetic continuity across tens of millennia without experiencing severe collapse. In some regions, especially northern Australia, there are signals of modest demographic expansion that correlate with changes in coastal productivity during warm periods. But these shifts do not erase the underlying deep time structure. High-resolution demographic reconstructions using tools like MSMC and SMC reveal that Aboriginal lineages diverged from other Eurasian populations soon after the initial out-of-Africa dispersal. They also suggest that there was little to no gene flow from other non-African groups into Australia after settlement. This isolation, however, was not total. There are faint hints of later contacts near coastal northern regions, possibly reflecting rare encounters with voyagers or maritime peoples in later prehistory. Yet these events left only minimal genetic traces and did not alter the foundational structure of the population. The deep story encoded in Aboriginal genomes therefore tells us something rare. Continuity is not simply the absence of movement, it is the presence of a stable relationship between people and land over immense spans of time. It reflects social systems capable of maintaining cohesion, ecological knowledge adaptable enough to weather climatic shifts, and cultural frameworks strong enough to preserve identity without relying on large empires, cities, or written archives. Most populations on Earth have experienced some form of replacement, fragmentation, or large-scale mixing over the past 10,000 years. In Australia, the genetic signatures show a lineage that remained distinct, adapting to landscapes that changed dramatically, yet still retained the memory of earlier epochs. This continuity is not uniformity. It does not mean the population was static or homogeneous. Instead, it reveals a mosaic of communities, each with its own history, shaped by local environments and cultural traditions. The genetic patterns show differences between desert populations, tropical populations, and those living in temperate regions. These differences deepen with time, reflecting the long arcs of regional histories. What unites them is not sameness, but a shared origin carried across 50 millennia of habitation. This unity, set against a backdrop of profound internal diversity, forms one of the most compelling narratives in global human prehistory. Continuity does not imply uniformity, it implies complexity. Imagine walking across a continent where every rise in the ground, every bend in a river, every change in the colour of stone has a name older than any temple on Earth. Picture a landscape so fully spoken that language itself becomes a map, guiding not simply movement, but memory. Australia, long before any written marks recorded its stories, carried one of the richest tapestries of human speech anywhere in the world. More than 400 distinct languages existed before European contact, each layered with dialects, each shaped by local histories and ecological boundaries. These languages did not survive by chance. They endured because they were woven directly into the land, preserved through systems designed to transmit knowledge across hundreds of generations. In a world where rivers shifted, coasts drowned, and deserts expanded or retreated, the question becomes clear. How do languages survive when landscapes change? Linguistic research provides the first hint of an answer. Australia's languages are not a uniform body. They represent one of the most complex examples of cultural branching seen in human prehistory. The largest family, known today as Pama-Nyungan, covers almost the entire continent, stretching from the tropical north to the temperate south. Its spread, reconstructed through comparative linguistics, appears to have begun around 4 millennia ago, which makes it one of the more recent large-scale expansions in Aboriginal history. But its relative recency does not diminish the deep time behind the structures it absorbed. Outside this broad family, smaller language groups survived in the north and northwest, maintaining distinct grammars and sound systems that may represent some of the oldest surviving linguistic lineages in the world. These non-Pama-Nyungan languages, clustered in regions such as Arnhem Land, the Kimberley and Cape York Peninsula, show patterns of diversity that hint at tens of thousands of years of separation and localized development. Their existence reveals that long before the Pama-Nyungan expansion, the continent housed a mosaic of speech communities shaped by local environments and kinship networks. Linguistic diversity on such a scale requires explanation. One factor is geography. Australia's varied regions, from monsoon forests to arid interiors to rugged coastlines, created natural boundaries that encourage differentiation. but geography alone cannot account for the precision with which information was preserved. Many of these languages use complex verb morphology, elaborate systems of noun classification, and highly structured kinship terms that encode social obligations into grammar itself. For example, avoidance speech registers, where individuals use entirely different vocabularies in the presence of certain in-laws, demonstrate how social relationships become linguistic rules. These systems create multiple layers of speech within the same community, increasing the density of information stored in the language. This density in turn strengthens the language's ability to act as a mnemonic structure, preserving knowledge not only about family and ritual, but about navigation, ecological cycles, and legal responsibilities. Another factor lies in the role of language as a repository of movement. Songlines, often described as pathways across the land encoded in narrative, rely on linguistic precision. Each segment of a journey is marked by place names, verbs of motion, and descriptive metaphors that correspond to features of the landscape. These are not abstract or symbolic references. They function as practical guides, allowing travellers to navigate from one water source to another over vast distances. Linguists studying the structure of songlines note their modularity. Each spoken unit corresponds to a specific landmark or ecological cue, making the stories both portable and adaptable. This modular structure acts like a biological memory system, ensuring that even if a landscape shifts slightly through erosion or vegetation change, the core pattern of the path remains intact. The persistence of non-Pama-Nyungan languages in remote regions further emphasises the importance of cultural mechanisms for maintaining linguistic accuracy. Many of these groups live in landscapes that require intimate ecological knowledge for survival. As a result, their languages carry detailed vocabularies for plant species, animal behaviours, seasonal indicators, and water sources. Anthropologists have documented dozens of distinct terms describing subtle atmospheric conditions, each with practical implications for hunting or travel. Losing such vocabulary would mean losing access to crucial environmental information. The necessity of survival therefore reinforced rigorous intergenerational transmission. One of the most striking features of Aboriginal languages is the relationship between kinship and accuracy. Many societies assign specific individuals responsibility for teaching certain stories or rituals. These roles are not symbolic. They carry precise obligations to preserve content exactly as received. Errors are corrected not through written texts, but through communal oversight, where elders, custodians, and ritual specialists cross-check each other's knowledge. Linguists studying oral transmission within these groups have noted levels of consistency that rival those of written traditions. This does not romanticize perfection. It simply recognizes that systems existed to maintain fidelity. In some communities, the order of narrative segments cannot be altered without violating ceremonial law, which reinforces stable frameworks of transmission. In this way, kinship becomes the backbone of linguistic durability. Yet another layer of linguistic stability emerges when we consider the role of multilingualism. Contrary to common assumptions, many Aboriginal groups were fluent in multiple languages or dialects, especially those living near cultural borders. This fluidity did not erase distinctions. Instead, it created a buffering effect, allowing communities to maintain their own linguistic identities while facilitating communication and exchange. Bilingual and trilingual individuals acted as cultural bridges, preserving the structure of their own language while understanding neighbouring systems. Historical linguistics shows that this pattern of multilingualism helped sustain diversity rather than collapse it. Borrowed words moved across regions, but core grammatical structures often remained resistant to outside influence. This balance between openness and preservation contributed to the extraordinary endurance of linguistic lineages. Linguistic reconstruction also reveals moments of convergence. The spread of Pama-Nyungan was not a simple replacement event. It appears to have involved branching, mixing, and the absorption of older local features into new grammatical systems. This expansion corresponds roughly with archaeological evidence of cultural innovations such as new stone tool technologies and shifts in ceremonial practices. While scholars debate the exact mechanisms, many argue that social alliances and shared ritual networks facilitated the spread of the language family. These alliances may have strengthened kinship obligations across wider areas, creating channels for the diffusion of linguistic features while still preserving regional identity. Even as Pama-Nyungan languages spread across much of the continent, they developed local dialects remarkably quickly, reflecting the enduring influence of landscape, resources, and group boundaries. When we read the linguistic record closely, it becomes clear that languages didn't merely survive change, they recorded it. The names of extinct rivers, now buried beneath desert dunes, persist in some northern languages. In the south, terms for ancient shorelines appear in vocabularies far inland, suggesting that people carried coastal memories with them as sea levels rose after the last ice age. In the central deserts, where sand dunes shift slowly over time, language encodes the orientation of landforms that may have looked slightly different thousands of years ago. These linguistic fossils, preserved in the grammar and vocabulary of modern speech, offer glimpses into environments long vanished. At the heart of this endurance lies a quiet realization. Languages here do not function as mere tools of communication. They operate as landscapes in their own right, shaping how people see, interpret, and move through the world. A language becomes a map because it ties identity to place, responsibility to memory, and movement to story. In such a system, losing a language is not simply losing words, it is losing a way of seeing, a way of negotiating the physical world, and a way of carrying the past into the present. That these languages survive for so long is not proof of isolation. It is proof of complex, resilient systems built to preserve meaning across deep time. Each language is a landscape, a way of seeing, remembering, and moving through the world. But landscapes also held the stories that shaped a moral universe. Picture a moment when the world becomes legible not through maps or written symbols, but through melody. Imagine standing in a vast open landscape, the horizon stretching so far that distance becomes a kind of silence, and realizing that the only way to find your way across it is to sing. Not metaphorically, not ritualistically, but practically. To sing a route is to walk it is to remember it, and to remember it is to inherit a history so stable that entire continents can be crossed with nothing more than a song. How can a song become a map? The answer lies in one of the most remarkable intellectual traditions ever developed by a human society, the Songlines of Aboriginal Australia. These are not poems or hymns, they are navigational systems encoded in sound, where melody holds the position of a road and rhythm becomes the logic of direction. In a world without writing, they demonstrate a precision of knowledge that rivals any cartographic tradition, and they show how memory, land, and lore can be woven together with such fidelity that tens of thousands of years of experience remain intact. To understand the revelation behind songlines, we first need to grasp their scale. Each songline traces the journey of an ancestral being across the continent, fixing every river, hill, spring, and rock formation into a precise sequence. This sequence is not a symbolic path, it is a literal one. When anthropologists recorded the structure of these songs in the 20th century, they found that specific verses correspond to exact features of the land. A change in pitch signals a rise in elevation. A repeated rhythmic pattern marks a fork in the path. A shift in tempo indicates an approaching water source. What appears to an outsider as an art form is revealed to be a deeply engineered memory technology. The land is the score, the singer is the reader, and the accuracy is enforced not by text, but by community oversight, where custodians of each segment correct errors as meticulously as scholars correcting manuscripts. One of the most astonishing aspects of songlines is their practical utility. Embedded instructions guide travellers toward waterholes known to be reliable, or warn them about those that dry out during certain seasons. Some songlines describe animal behaviour, indicating when kangaroos move across plains or when certain birds signal the presence of fresh water. Others contain plant knowledge, roots that can be eaten raw, leaves that must be processed, flowers that, when particular resources are in their prime. These ecological cues are not taught separately. They are built into the flow of the song, allowing a traveller to read the environment while singing its map. We do not know for certain how early these systems developed, but linguistic and ethnographic evidence suggests that their core structures predate the most recent shifts in climate at the end of the last glacial cycle. This means that some songlines may carry information dating back tens of thousands of years, long before many written traditions even began. Another dimension appears when we look at songlines as connectors rather than local guides. Some stretch across entire regions, linking groups separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometres. In these cases, each community is responsible for a segment, preserving its accuracy and passing it to travellers who must continue the path beyond their own territory. This distributed custodianship creates long networks of shared knowledge, enabling trade routes that cross the continent. Archaeological evidence supports this. Objects such as pearl shell ornaments from the northwest coast have been found in central desert regions, demonstrating long-distance exchange. Ochre from specific quarries has been traced through chemical signatures to distant locations, showing that materials moved along well-established routes. These movements were not random wanderings. They were carefully coordinated paths integrated into ritual cycles and social alliances, sustained by the precision of songline memory. The cross-continental reach of these songs hints at a deeper structure, the ability of language and melody to maintain coherence across vast distances. Some songlines contain shared segments, recognizable across different linguistic groups. This does not imply uniformity. The lyrics may shift, the pronunciation may vary, but the core melodic steps remain intact. Scholars studying these patterns note that the melody acts as the anchor, controlling the order of landmarks and ensuring that modifications in vocabulary do not break the navigational flow. This is a form of redundancy built into the system. Even if languages change or diverge, the melodic contour maintains the continuity of the route. In this way, songlines function as one of the most elegant examples of error correction in oral cultures. The system anticipates change and accommodates it without allowing the underlying structure to fracture. Ceremonial teaching reinforces this accuracy. In many communities, songlines are taught gradually over decades, with elders guiding younger custodians through cycles of initiation and practice. Some songs are performed only in specific seasons or under strict ceremonial conditions. These limitations do not restrict access arbitrarily. They protect the integrity of knowledge by ensuring that it is passed with appropriate context and ritual oversight. Errors are corrected publicly and immediately, with senior custodians listening for deviations in melody, rhythm, or phrasing. These corrections ensure stability across generations. The result is a system where practical navigation, ecological understanding, and spiritual lore are transmitted seamlessly through an aesthetic form. It is knowledge disguised as beauty, or perhaps beauty disguised as knowledge. We can also examine songlines through the lens of cognitive science. Humans have extraordinary capacity for auditory memory, especially when information is structured rhythmically. Songs allow the brain to store far more information than prose. They reduce cognitive load by distributing meaning across melody, creating multiple retrieval cues, pitch for elevation, rhythm for direction, pattern for distance. Some lines use repeating sequences that map geological formations to auditory motifs, making it nearly impossible to forget the order of landmarks. The precision of these motifs is one reason songlines remain stable, even when landscapes change subtly across centuries. The melody holds the memory in place. The land may shift, but the song anchors its structure. Ethnographic accounts provide further insight. In some regions, travellers who know the appropriate songs can move across territories without conflict, because singing the correct segment signals that they come under the authority of the local custodians. This creates a remarkable social dimension. Songlines act as passports. They regulate travel, facilitate exchange, and reinforce alliances. This system is not chaotic or ad hoc. It is organised, relational, and deeply embedded in cultural lore. The result is a continent-wide network of interlocking responsibilities, where movement is guided as much by memory as by geography. What makes songlines truly extraordinary is not simply their practical utility, but their ability to contain multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. A single verse may describe a hill, record a historical event, encode a spiritual teaching, and instruct a traveller to watch for a particular plant species all at once. This multi-layered structure allows communities to carry vast amounts of information in compact and easily transmitted units. It also explains how songlines could preserve memories of landscapes that no longer exist. Some songs describe rivers that dried thousands of years ago, or coastlines that are now submerged. These descriptions often align with geological reconstructions of ancient environments. While we must be cautious when linking oral traditions to deep-time events, the consistency with which some features appear suggests that certain songlines may indeed record ecological changes from long before the present era. The realization that emerges from all this is quiet but profound. A culture endures when its knowledge can be sung, walked, and inherited in one gesture. Songlines represent more than a wayfinding method. They form one of the most sophisticated memory systems ever created by human societies. They integrate ecological science, social law, spiritual meaning, and practical survival into a single melodic framework. They reveal how a people can remain deeply connected to land across tens of thousands of years without relying on written texts or centralized authority. They also remind us that intellectual traditions need not conform to modern categories to demonstrate complexity or rigor. The structure of a songline examined in detail displays a level of cognitive engineering that rivals any written archive. Along these paths, some stories captured worlds that no longer exist. You're standing inside a rock shelter as the last light of the day grazes the stone, and the shapes painted above you seem older than the horizon itself. They look familiar in the way human figures often do, yet something about them feels slightly out of reach, as though the hands that made these images belong to people whose names and descendants have long since disappeared. The question rises quietly, with no urgency. What remains of those who arrived too early to endure? We know from archaeology that the path into Sahul was not a single uninterrupted story. Human presence here stretches farther back than the ancestry of the people who live on the continent today, and some groups may have arrived, flourished briefly, and vanished before their traces could solidify into an unbroken line. This is the beginning of the segment's revelation, that Australia carries memories not only of the people who stayed, but of those whose lineages wandered into deep time without surviving in modern genomes. The evidence comes slowly, like footprints revealed as wind lifts sand from the ground. We do not know for certain when the earliest humans reached northern Australia, but several sites suggest occupations older than the conservative figure of 50 millennia. Some excavations in places like the Top End and parts of Arnhem Land have produced fragments of habitation that seem to stretch toward the 60 millennia horizon, perhaps even beyond, though these claims remain carefully debated. The deeper layers often contain tools or hearths that do not reappear in later sequences, implying that whoever made them belonged to cultural traditions that did not last or were absorbed by later groups. This is not unusual in human history. Archaeology often reveals the outlines of peoples who arrived early, stayed briefly, and disappeared long before the populations that shape our present genetic map. One of the most intriguing clues lies in the depictions of megafauna on certain rock surfaces. These animals, long vanished by the time the dominant ancestral lineages became established, appear in forms that do not match the more stable artistic styles of later millennia. Some paintings show proportions or anatomical features that reflect a first-hand familiarity with creatures that went extinct more than 40,000 years ago. This suggests the existence of cultural horizons tied directly to ecological worlds that no longer existed when the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians diversified across the continent. These early artists left behind silhouettes and outlines that today act almost as timestamps, marking layers in the human story of Sehol, whose genetic signatures have not survived in present populations. Archaeologists have also noted stylistic differences between certain early artworks and the traditions that followed. In some shelters, the oldest pigment layers belong to forms that show little continuity with later artistic systems, almost as though one cultural lineage created images that were later painted over by another with a distinct worldview. These differences are not considered indications of separate species or isolated migrations, but they do hint at the presence of groups whose traditions were not carried forward. The same quiet mystery appears in paleogenomic records as gaps rather than connections. When geneticists model the ancestry of living Aboriginal communities, their results converge strongly around populations that expanded across Australia after roughly 50 millennia ago. Lineages that may have arrived earlier do not show up in the genomes of modern people, implying either that these early settlers died out or were absorbed so completely that their genetic contribution no longer appears in measurable form. It is here that the question of myth becomes archaeological, not spiritual. Across many regions, stories speak of ancestral beings or first people who shaped the land in ways distinct from later ancestral figures. These are not metaphors in the modern sense. They represent inherited frameworks that sometimes preserve the memory of earlier populations, not as biological descendants, but as cultural predecessors. In some traditions, these first ones are described as having appearances, voices, or movements different from those of the present order. Their tracks might be attributed to animals or hybrid forms, their actions shaping hills, rivers, or cliffs. It is not that these stories describe literal alternate humans, rather they safeguard the recognition that the continent has been lived in and shaped across multiple horizons. Myth becomes the vessel for remembering what archaeology only hints at. People lived here before the lineages that survived. The possibility of early waves that did not persist is strengthened by the paleogenomic silence that surrounds them. Genome-wide analyses rely on measurable ancestry, and when such ancestry is absent in later populations, it implies that earlier groups either remained small or faced pressures that prevented long-term survival. environmental changes during the late Pleistocene, including shifts in rainfall patterns and resource availability, could have imposed challenges that early settlers could not overcome. Later waves, arriving within a more stable climatic window, may have expanded more successfully, establishing the genetic foundations visible today. This is consistent with known patterns elsewhere in the world. Human history is full of vanished lineages. Europe, for instance, once hosted a variety of early modern human groups who left little or no genetic trace in later populations. Their tools remain, but their bloodlines ended. Language provides another quiet clue. When linguists reconstruct the deep branching of Australian languages, the internal patterns point strongly toward a dominant expansion beginning roughly 4 millennia ago for Pama-Nyungan, and older, more regionally stable patterns for non-Pama families. Nothing in these structures indicates the presence of a vast earlier linguistic substrate underlying all later languages. This absence does not prove there were no earlier groups. It only suggests that the languages that survived belonged to lineages that were already well established when the earliest detectable linguistic families began to take shape. Whatever tongues the first unsuccessful waves spoke left no structural descendants, just as their genes left no measurable legacy. Still, absence is a kind of evidence. Where genetics remains silent, rock art speaks faintly. In some shelters, pigment analysis reveals layers older than the oldest securely dated cultural traditions. Their forms differ in proportion, technique, and subject matter. They show animals that vanished tens of millennia ago, humans engaged in practices that do not reappear later, and styles without clear lineage. Archaeologists describe these as palimpsests, layered histories in which one cultural horizon paints over another. Each layer belongs to a people who understood this landscape in their own way, shaping stone with meanings that, while not preserved in words or genes, remain as traces of worlds that did not continue. Even the continental spread models hint at lost populations, simulations showing how swiftly people could have crossed Australia after arrival point to rapid movement across ecological zones. Yet some of the earliest sites do not sit along the most efficient routes for later expansions. Instead, they appear tucked into northern pockets that show no direct link to later population centres. This discontinuity is part of the story. It suggests that early movement patterns may not align with the main ancestral corridors that later defined Aboriginal settlement across the continent. These early pockets may belong to groups whose migrations did not shape the futures that followed. This brings us to the realization that extinction can leave echoes even when nothing biological remains. The first waves into Sahul may have failed in biological terms, but their presence left impressions in stone, in landscape modifications, in mythic structures, and possibly in cultural motifs that were absorbed by later groups who encountered their remnants. Knowledge does not always descend through blood. Sometimes it passes across cultural contact zones or lingers in the stories that later peoples attach to particular places. Some rock shelters described as homes of ancestral spirits may be sites originally associated with earlier cultural groups, their meanings reinterpreted over thousands of years. Myths that speak of beings before the first ancestors may reflect recognition that humans have occupied this land across successive horizons. The truth is modest. We cannot name these early groups. We cannot reconstruct their languages or model their genetics. What we have are hints, shadows, and layers. Archaeology gives us shells of hearths, pigment traces and tools that fall outside later traditions. Genetics shows us silence rather than descent. Myth offers figures whose actions and identities sit at the boundary of remembered time. Together, these traces remind us that human presence on this continent began with groups who walked into deep time and left only echoes behind them. The enduring peoples of Australia inherit a landscape shaped partly by those who came too early to leave descendants, yet not too early to leave memory. Transition. But endurance also requires adaptation to shifts more violent than time. A world where the horizon itself begins to move. A world where the sea, once distant and predictable, begins to climb each season, swelling into marshes, swallowing river mouths, and turning familiar ground into a memory. Picture a land where the coast you knew as a child is no longer the coast your grandchildren will inherit. This was the Australia of the Great Warming that followed the last glacial maximum. The question rises softly beside the ancient shore. How does a culture persist when the world around it transforms not slowly, but decisively? When familiar paths vanish underwater, and the stories tied to certain headlands or plains are suddenly left without their physical anchor? The answer, as the evidence suggests, is not resistance, but a kind of renewal. A continuity that accepts change without losing itself. Archaeology makes the scale of transformation clear. Around 20,000 years ago, the sea stood far below its modern level, leaving broad plains exposed around the continent. The continental shelf was not hidden beneath waves, but stretched outward as a mosaic of woodlands, grasslands, and coastal dunes. Then, the warming began. Glaciers melted far from Australia, yet the effects reached every part of this land. The oceans rose first slowly, then with increasing pace, sometimes climbing meters within a human lifetime. Shorelines retreated inland, islands were born, peninsulas detached, rivers changed course. The old coastal plains, once home to communities who hunted, gathered, and buried their dead, slipped beneath the surface. What had been stable for thousands of years became unstable within centuries, then decades. We do not know for certain how each group experienced this encroaching water, but the archaeological pattern suggests internal migrations rather than collapse. Sites that once sat on ancient coastlines become abandoned and replaced by new settlements farther inland. Shell middens that once marked shoreline activity appear in bands corresponding to the shifting coastline. As the sea rose, communities moved, not in panic, but in a slow and steady adaptation to new niches. Some of the earliest evidence for this lies in the changing distribution of stone tools. Assemblages that once reflected coastal foraging strategies become more inland-focused, with an increase in tools suited to wooded or riverine environments. New sources of stone appear in toolkits, indicating expanded movement or new trade networks, formed to compensate for lost territories. Technological adjustments reflect this environmental reorientation. In areas where estuaries expanded, evidence shows a growing emphasis on fishing, shellfish collection, and exploitation of new aquatic resources. Where freshwater wetlands emerged behind rising coastal barriers, people experimented with plant processing that had not existed in earlier colder periods. In regions where familiar hunting grounds flooded, mobility patterns changed. Archaeology shows more seasonal movement, suggesting that people tracked resources along new ecological gradients. This was not reinvention from scratch. It was renewal, a shift that kept core practices intact while folding new realities into them. The remarkable part is that ceremonial sites did not vanish in the same way the coast did. Even as shorelines transformed, rock shelters inland remained active, and some appear to have increased in significance. Certain petroglyph fields that had been in use during colder periods continue through the warming, with newer layers of art added over older ones. This continuity suggests that while the physical geography changed drastically, the cultural geography remained anchored to places that kept their meaning regardless of rising seas. One example can be seen in some sandstone upland regions, where ancient shelters contain artwork spanning many millennia. The surrounding environment may have shifted from semi-arid plains to more humid woodlands, but the sites themselves kept their ritual importance. Tradition remained steady even when landforms did not. Regional identities also stabilised across this transitional epoch. Genetic studies indicate that by 30 millennia ago, distinct regional populations within Australia were already forming. These identities endured through the end of the Ice Age. This suggests that internal migrations in response to sea level rise were mostly local adjustments rather than continent-wide dispersals. People moved within traditional territories or along boundaries shared with related groups. They adapted at the edges rather than entirely abandoning ancestral regions. This kind of flexibility allowed communities to maintain their cultural frameworks, even as ecological conditions changed dramatically. Paleoclimate studies provide further context. During the early Holocene, roughly between 11 and 8 millennia ago, the rate of sea level rise accelerated as the last major glacial remnants melted. This is when some of the coastal plains that had existed since the Pleistocene were finally inundated. At the same time, rainfall patterns shifted. Areas that had once been dry became more hospitable. Others that had been forested became more open. Aboriginal societies adjusted accordingly. The archaeological record shows diversification in subsistence strategies. Some regions adopted intensified fishing, others expanded their use of freshwater resources, still others adapted to new types of vegetation emerging in their territories. One of the quietest and most telling pieces of evidence is the continued use of ochre across the continent throughout this entire period. The pigments vary by region and by geological source, yet their use never declines. Even as seas rose and rivers changed course, the symbolic function of ochre remained intact. It continued to mark bodies, ceremonial tools, and sacred spaces. This continuity suggests that identity in its deepest form was not tied to fixed landforms, but to relationships maintained through ritual. In some sites, researchers observe shifts in burial practices that coincide with environmental change. Rather than abandoning old burial zones that were threatened by rising water, people created new ones that mirrored the old. These new cemeteries reflect continuity in social structure and belief, even as their physical locations moved. Patterns of grave goods, body orientation, and ceremonial treatment remained stable. The landscape changed, but the cultural grammar did not. There is also evidence that long-distance exchange networks persisted through this transition. Some stone types found in certain regions originate hundreds of kilometers away, implying that intergroup contact remained strong despite shifting ecological boundaries. As coastlines shrank, these networks may have even intensified, helping communities exchange resources and knowledge that ensured survival across diverse environments. The strengthening rather than weakening of these networks during a period of dramatic ecological change is a notable contrast to many other prehistoric contexts, where environmental stress often leads to fragmentation. Another line of evidence lies in the botanical record. Pollen analysis from ancient lakes and cores taken from wetlands show significant changes in vegetation during the warming period. Grasslands expanded in some regions, while forests retreated or advanced in others. Aboriginal burning practices also interacted with these shifts. Controlled burns continued to shape the distribution of plant communities, creating mosaic landscapes that supported diverse species. This adaptability ensured that food sources remained reliable, even when ecological zones changed around them. We don't know exactly how stories changed during this time, but correlations between oral traditions and geological events suggest that narratives adapted alongside landscapes. Some stories speak of rivers that once flowed differently, or of islands that were once attached to the mainland. The accuracy of these tales matching geological data from 8 to 9 millennia ago indicates that oral traditions absorbed environmental change without losing coherence. These stories did not simply record events. They offered frameworks for interpreting change as part of a larger ongoing creation, rather than as disruption. This is perhaps why Aboriginal societies did not collapse during the end of the Ice Age. They did not conceive of land as static. They conceived of it as a living process. When the sea rose, it was not an ending, a movement within a larger story. Territories were not abandoned. They were reinterpreted. The symbolic map endured even as the physical map shifted. This worldview, grounded in continuity rather than in fixed boundaries, allowed cultural traditions to remain stable for tens of millennia. One can imagine a community watching a familiar headland disappear beneath waves and understanding it not as erasure but as transformation. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain sacred stories became tied to new features in the landscape, such as newly formed islands or altered river mouths. This ability to reinterpret and renew traditions rather than discard them is central to understanding how Aboriginal societies endured such drastic environmental flux. The realization is simple but profound. Adaptation here was not reinvention but renewal. People didn't rebuild their world from fragments. They carried the world with them and let it settle in new shapes around the same moral, ceremonial and social foundations. Continuity did not require stillness. It required the ability to let change become part of the pattern. Transition. Change would come again, but from a force not geological. A shoreline that has known only the rhythms of wind, tide and ancestral movement for thousands upon thousands of years. A shoreline where every headland has a name older than memory, where every rise and hollow is woven into the stories that teach law and belonging. Now picture one morning when the horizon changes shape. A dark outline appears where there should only be the pale shimmer of heat above the water. It moves with a rhythm unfamiliar to the people on the beach, a slow rocking that does not match the cadence of canoes made from bark or dug-out wood. The people watching do not panic. Curiosity rises slowly, like a tide. What happens when a closed world meets visitors from a distance so great that even story is not prepared for them? The answer, as the evidence suggests, is a response marked not by fear or collapse, but by a careful, deliberate kind of openness. We know from historical and archaeological sources that long before European powers entered these waters, there were visitors who came to the northern Australian coast. The earliest well-documented were the Macassan trepang fishers, seafarers from what is now Sulawesi, who ventured south in search of sea cucumbers. Their presence began around the 17th century of the Common Era, though some scholars argue for earlier contacts based on linguistic and botanical evidence. They arrived on characteristic wooden prows with large sails, navigating monsoon winds that carried them across the Arafura Sea. Their journeys were seasonal. They came when the winds favoured travel, harvested trepang along the coasts of Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, traded with local groups, and then returned north before the storms of the wet season. Archaeology gives us a clear record of their activity. The remains of stone lines used to smoke and dry trepang still stand in some coastal areas, marking places where Macassan crews established temporary processing camps. Fragments of pottery have been found in association with these sites. Some pieces are clearly imported, including ceramics that match types known from Indonesian kilns of the 17th and 18th centuries of the Common Era. Iron tools, rare in pre-contact Aboriginal Australia, appear in some layers associated with Macassan visits. The presence of tamarind trees in certain regions, a species not native to Australia, is also linked to these interactions. Some of these trees date back centuries, and likely sprouted from seeds discarded by Macassan crews as they rested along the shore. Linguistic evidence provides another quiet but compelling line of insight. Words of Macassan origin entered several Aboriginal languages of northern Australia. Terms relating to boats, trade, and certain tools persist in the vocabularies of groups who interacted regularly with Trepang fishers. These linguistic traces help us track the intensity and distribution of contact. They also reveal selective adoption. Not every introduced term took root. People integrated what was useful and ignored what did not align with their existing frameworks of meaning. The historical record, supported by both Indigenous oral history and colonial era documentation, describes exchange relationships that developed between Macassan crews and local clans. These exchanges included goods such as cloth, tobacco, metal tools, and rice. In return, Aboriginal groups offered labour, food, pearl shell, and navigational guidance through the complex coastal waters. Some clans formed enduring relationships with specific Macassan captains, renewing them year after year. These relationships did not imply domination or dependence. They were reciprocal and often governed by protocols that resembled existing Aboriginal systems of alliance and exchange. There is archaeological evidence of Aboriginal communities modifying their tools in response to the availability of metal. Stone points and cutting implements continued in use, but iron blades and axes were incorporated into certain activities. This reflected not a wholesale replacement of indigenous technology, but a selective integration. Metal offered advantages in tasks such as tree cutting or carving, but stone remained abundant, familiar, and culturally embedded. Material culture does not change simply because a new substance becomes available. It changes when communities decide that a new material fits into their existing way of life. Ceremonial practices too show signs of engagement with these early visitors. Some rock art across northern Australia includes depictions of foreign vessels, often stylized but immediately recognizable as Macassan praus. These images emphasize the high sails, the distinctive rigging, and the shape of the hull. They're not simple illustrations. They are records of encounters, framed within symbolic traditions that already had ways of incorporating the appearance of unusual beings or objects into the broader cosmological story. In some regions, rituals developed that reference Macassan visitors in ways that blended observation with ancestral interpretation. The ceremonies remained indigenous in structure and purpose. The new element became part of the ongoing conversation between land, people, and story. One of the striking features of these early encounters is the absence of a large-scale demographic change. Genetic studies show no significant Macassan ancestry in Aboriginal populations. The interactions, though meaningful, were limited by seasonality and by the Macassans' own priorities. They were not looking for land to occupy permanently. Their goal was economic, and their visits followed a regular pattern shaped by the wind cycle. This allowed Aboriginal groups to engage on their own terms, without facing the pressures that accompany permanent settlement. The rhythms of Macassan arrival and departure became just another part of the annual cycle, no more disruptive than the return of certain animals during migration seasons. This helps explain why core cosmological and social structures remained intact. Indigenous lore, grounded in kinship, land ties, and ancestral narratives, was not threatened by the presence of foreign visitors. If anything, the ability to incorporate new elements without destabilizing existing structures demonstrates the strength of that system. Aboriginal societies had mechanisms for classifying the unfamiliar. New objects, words, and behaviours could be interpreted through the lens of established categories. What could not be integrated simply remained external, observed but not transformative. Historical accounts from the early 19th century of the Common Era when European observers first documented Macassan activity, describe interactions characterized by mutual respect and predictable patterns. Some Aboriginal individuals travelled north with Macassan crews, returning the following season with new experiences and stories. Their journeys did not lead to cultural rupture. They were framed within the same logic that allowed for long-distance trade between Aboriginal groups across the continent. Movement was not foreign to these societies. It was a normal part of human relationships, governed by clear obligations and protocols. There were also boundaries. The Macassan presence was tolerated and sometimes welcomed, but it never replaced indigenous authority over land. The rights and responsibilities embedded in the landscape remained under the stewardship of Aboriginal groups. Macassan crews operated within defined zones and often sought permission to camp or work in certain areas. The local clans maintained jurisdiction, and the Macassans recognised it. This balance prevented conflict and preserved the integrity of Aboriginal land tenure. We do not know every detail of how each community interpreted these encounters. Oral histories vary among groups, reflecting different degrees of contact, different local priorities, and different experiences. Some stories emphasize the benefits of trade. Others highlight the novelty of the ships. Still others place the visitors within spiritual frameworks, classifying them as people from across the sea whose journeys intersected with ancestral paths. These variations underscore a key point. Aboriginal societies did not respond uniformly. They responded locally through the filter of their own histories and cosmologies. What the evidence consistently reveals is a pattern of incorporation without erasure, selective adoption, careful engagement, cultural confidence. There is a quiet resilience in this pattern. It speaks to societies that understood themselves not as fragile but as deeply grounded. Identity here was not a brittle structure dependent on static conditions. It was a living system capable of absorbing new stimuli without losing its coherence. This becomes even more apparent when we compare the Macassan encounter with later European contact. The two interactions were fundamentally different. The Macassan presence was seasonal, respectful of local authority, and oriented around trade. European colonization brought settlement, displacement, and radical disruption. The contrast highlights how the nature of contact shapes its consequences. The earlier encounters reveal that Aboriginal societies were not inherently vulnerable to external influence. They were capable of maintaining continuity in the face of novelty, so long as the terms of engagement allowed for mutual recognition. When we consider the archaeological and historical data together, the realization becomes clear. A culture confident in its foundations can absorb without dissolving. The arrival of the first strangers did not signal collapse. It became one more layer in a landscape already rich with stories of change and continuity. These early visitors were woven into the broader narrative, not as conquerors or invaders, but as brief participants in the long human history of the northern coast. Transition. But the next encounter would test those foundations completely. Imagine this. A world that survived the rise of seas, the fall of climates, the long turning of tens of thousands of years. A world where lore flowed through story, where identity was layered into the land itself, where language mapped every valley and ridge with a precision trained across unbroken millennia. Now imagine a silence descending on that world. Not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of being forcibly unheard. What does survival mean after nearly everything is taken? How does a culture built on continuity endure a rupture so sudden that the land itself seems to exhale in shock? The evidence suggests that survival becomes something quieter, almost invisible, but no less real. European colonization, beginning in the late 18th century of the Common Era, arrived not like the seasonal presence of earlier visitors, but like a force without ebb or permission. The first and most devastating impact came from disease. We know from historical accounts, colonial records, and epidemiological modelling that introduced pathogens spread far ahead of direct contact. Smallpox, influenza, and measles travelled through interconnected kin networks, carried unknowingly by people trying to maintain relationships that had shaped life for so long. Oral histories from diverse regions speak of villages emptied almost overnight, of elders lost before they could pass on the full cycles of stories and obligations that held social worlds together. It is difficult to quantify these losses precisely, but scholars estimate mortality rates that reached catastrophic levels. A people who had adapted to every environmental shift imaginable now faced an enemy the land could not explain. As populations were reduced, the pressure of land dispossession intensified. The doctrine of terra nullius, which declared the continent unoccupied in a legal sense, stripped indigenous communities of recognised authority over their territories. This was not simply a matter of land taken. It was a removal of the anchor that tied story, kinship, and law to specific places. At the level of archaeology, we see the consequences in the abandonment of long-inhabited sites, in the disruption of ceremonial landscapes, and in the sudden shifts in settlement patterns documented in early colonial surveys. Fields of petroglyphs and ancient paths remained physically present, but the ability to access them was often restricted by colonial legal structures and pastoral expansion. The landscape that had once been read like a living manuscript was now crossed by fences and property lines that bore no relationship to ancestral order. Mission systems emerged across the continent, varying in form but sharing a common objective: to reshape indigenous identity by replacing cultural frameworks with European religious and social structures. Archival records from the 19th and early 20th centuries of the Common Era describe policies aimed at isolating children, suppressing languages, regulating movement, and discouraging or punishing ceremonial practices. Linguists studying the patterns of language loss note that many languages vanished in this period, not because they lacked vitality, but because their use became dangerous. Some were not recorded in written form until after only a few speakers remained. Others were remembered only in fragments by individuals who had preserved them secretly, passing them on in whispered conversations or encoded within songs that seemed ordinary to outside listeners. The disruption of songlines represents one of the most profound breaks documented by anthropologists and indigenous custodians. Traditional movement patterns, which connected distant regions through ceremonial exchange, trade, and ancestral obligations, were interrupted by new borders, mission restrictions, and forced relocations. Some paths faded when elders who carried the verses died before initiating successors. Others were purposely kept hidden, preserved by small groups who continued to walk them in secret despite prohibitions. Archaeology reveals traces of this persistence. Footpaths worn into certain soils continue to be used, even when colonial maps declared the areas uninhabited. Rock art created during this period sometimes includes symbols that reference older stories in compressed form, suggesting efforts to maintain continuity through subtle means. Despite these ruptures, core identity structures endured. They endured not because they were untouched, but because people found ways to guard what mattered most. This is evident in the survival of kinship systems, which, although strained by displacement and demographic collapse, remained remarkably resilient. Even in missions where families were separated and communal organisation was tightly controlled, kinship terminologies persisted. children grew up with a sense of relational identity that echoed pre-contact categories, even when they had been distanced from the land that originally defined those relationships. Oral guardianship played a crucial role. Individuals entrusted with the fragments of stories, songs, or ritual knowledge preserved them, sometimes at significant personal risk. Their efforts form one of the most understated but essential elements of cultural survival. Historical linguistics offers further evidence of hidden continuities. Some languages that seemed lost resurfaced decades later, when researchers discovered elderly speakers who had maintained fluency in private. In a few cases, entire dialects were reconstructed from these last custodians, demonstrating that disappearance from the public sphere did not always equate to true extinction. Anthropologists studying ceremonial practices recorded moments in which seemingly forgotten rituals were enacted with precision once conditions allowed. These moments reveal a deeper truth. Suppression is not the same as erasure. Knowledge can be carried quietly across generations, waiting for a space where it can breathe again. Material culture also reflects this duality of loss and persistence. Imported tools and objects became part of daily life, yet older technologies and artistic forms continued in modified or symbolic ways. Carved designs on wooden shields produced during the 19th century of the Common Era sometimes reflect ancestral motifs in simplified or coded forms, hinting at the presence of deeper knowledge beneath the surface. In some regions, rock art created during the colonial period includes hybrid imagery, blending introduced elements with long-standing iconographic traditions. These pieces act as quiet declarations that despite upheaval, the ancestral story remained alive in the hands of those who continued to create. We should acknowledge that the scale of devastation recorded in both indigenous testimony and historical documentation is profound. Communities were broken apart, languages fell silent, connection to land was severed or constrained. And yet, even in the midst of this, there were strategies of endurance. Some were adaptive, like integrating new materials or forging political alliances. Others were protective, like disguising ceremonies within Christian frameworks or embedding traditional teachings in forms that appeared innocuous to colonial authorities. Still, others were quiet acts of defiance, small rituals performed in remote places where watchful eyes could not follow. Archaeology reveals that certain sacred sites continued to be cared for, even during periods of intense surveillance. Hearths were maintained, offerings were left, paths were cleared. These acts did not restore the full ceremonial life of earlier centuries, but they sustained a thread of continuity that later generations could trace. In areas where the land was less accessible, memory shifted into narrative. Stories of specific sites were kept alive even when journeys to those places were no longer possible. When access returned in the late 20th century of the Common Era, some of these locations were found exactly where the stories had said they were, preserved in the landscape like pages in a sealed archive. Historians working with indigenous communities have documented the process by which these memories were reactivated. Elders travelled back to regions from which their families had been displaced, carrying narratives that had survived through decades of separation. Their descriptions matched the physical evidence on the ground with striking accuracy. This shows not only the durability of memory, but the intentionality of its preservation. Knowledge was not kept accidentally. It was held with care by people who believed it would one day be needed again. Realization emerges slowly from this evidence. Endurance is not invulnerability. It does not deny suffering or minimize loss. Instead, it names the quiet, deliberate work of persistence that continued even when the world became unrecognizable. A culture shaped across 50 millennia did not vanish because it was wounded. It adapted, contracted, hid, and waited. And when conditions shifted, it began to reassert itself through language revival projects, land rights movements, and the re-establishment of ceremonial authority. None of this erases what was lost, but it confirms what survived. Transition. And yet, even in collapse, memory found ways to rise again. A story so old that it remembers coastlines that no longer exist. A story carried through the mouths of countless ancestors. A story that once fell to a whisper, but never reached silence. Now imagine that same story beginning to lift its voice again, not as an echo of what was lost, but as something living, present, and steady. How do ancient stories find their voice in a modern world? The evidence suggests they do so slowly, patiently, and with a care shaped by generations who safeguarded knowledge in the shadows, waiting for a time when the world might finally listen. The revival unfolding across Aboriginal Australia today is not a return in the dramatic sense. It is not the rebuilding of something shattered. It is the reactivation of structures that persisted beneath the surface, even during periods of devastating suppression. The late 20th century of the Common Era marks a turning point that scholars often describe not simply as political change, but as the beginning of a cultural relighting. The recognition of native title, affirmed by the High Court in the landmark Mabo decision of 1992, challenged the long-standing doctrine of terra nullius. For the first time in centuries, the legal system acknowledged that indigenous law and land connection had survived the entire colonial period. This legal shift did not suddenly restore what had been taken, but it opened a space where land could once again anchor identity, ceremony, and memory. Anthropologists working with communities in the decades following the decision observed a rapid increase in cultural documentation projects. These were not academic impositions, they were indigenous-led initiatives designed to record languages, revive ceremonies, and re-identify sacred places that had been inaccessible for generations. Linguists were often invited to assist, but ownership and control remained firmly with the custodians. This is one of the defining features of the modern revival, the insistence that cultural renewal must be guided by those who carry the knowledge, not by external frameworks. Language sits at the centre of this revival. Before colonization, Australia held more than 400 languages, many of them complex and regionally distinct. By the late 20th century, many were believed to be on the brink of disappearance. Yet when communities began to rebuild linguistic knowledge, unexpected resilience emerged. Elders who had remained quiet speakers for decades stepped forward to teach. In some areas, dictionaries were created from whispered memories held by individuals who had kept their ancestral tongue alive in private. Classroom programs, immersion camps, and community workshops began to reintroduce these languages to younger generations. The process was not uniform. Some languages had only a handful of speakers, while others retained broader fluency. But in each case, the act of teaching reconnected people not merely to a vocabulary, but to a world view. Language is not a collection of words, it is a map of relationships, a guide for understanding country, kinship, and story. Its revival therefore restores more than communication, it restores orientation. Cultural centres emerged as focal points for this work. Built through local effort and often situated on reclaimed or recognised country, these centres function as living archives. They house recordings, genealogies, song transcripts, artefact collections and teaching materials. But they also serve as gathering places where story and ceremony can be practised openly. Anthropological studies describe how these centres became hubs for ranger programs that link cultural knowledge with environmental management. Young rangers learn ecological skills alongside ancestral obligations. fire regimes shaped by thousands of years of indigenous practice are reintroduced to landscapes that had suffered under suppression of controlled burning. Archaeologists working with ranger teams often remark on the accuracy with which elders can predict the presence of ancient sites. Even places not visited for generations are found through reference to stories that survived in oral form. Ceremonial life also experienced renewal. In many regions, ceremonies that had been discouraged or prohibited during mission periods were revived once communities regained access to country and the freedom to gather. These revivals did not attempt to replicate the past in static form. They took shape through the knowledge held by custodians who remembered fragments, songs or sequences taught before the disruptions of the 20th century. Some ceremonies unfolded in their near-original structure. Others combined older elements with new teachings appropriate to contemporary life. The purpose remained consistent, reaffirming relationships between people, ancestors, and land. Ceremonies once whispered behind mission fences returned to open ground, singing into the night. Dreaming narratives, too, found renewed expression. These stories, which serve as cosmological frameworks, legal systems, and moral guides, had survived through secret transmission even when their public performance was forbidden. With the return of cultural autonomy, they re-emerged not as relics but as living principles. Some communities established storytelling nights to teach younger generations. Others created illustrated books or digital archives to preserve versions for future custodians. In each context, the revival respected the protocols of knowledge ownership. Some stories could be shared widely. Others remained restricted, protected by the same kin-based structures that had preserved them through harsher eras. Archaeology became an unexpected ally in this revival. Community-led archaeological teams increasingly took responsibility for documenting and preserving rock art, ceremonial grounds, and ancient habitation sites. This shift, from archaeology performed on indigenous land to archaeology performed with and by indigenous custodians, altered the field profoundly. In some regions, new rock art galleries were discovered by elders revisiting childhood memories. Others were found through systematic surveys conducted by ranger groups trained in archaeological methods. The documentation of these sites not only preserved them for the future, but also reaffirmed connection to country. When people stand before images created by their ancestors tens of thousands of years ago, the continuity of identity becomes not an abstract concept but a physical presence. One of the most striking aspects of the contemporary revival is the rethreading of songlines across landscapes that had been divided by fences, borders, and infrastructure. Though some pathways were lost during the periods of forced relocation, others persisted in story and were revived once access returned. Recovering these paths involved both ceremonial work and practical navigation. Elders described the sequences of landmarks associated with particular verses. Rangers mapped these sequences using modern tools. Archaeologists confirmed the presence of markers, campsites, or art panels along the routes. The result was not simply a reconstruction of old trails, but the reactivation of ancient systems of movement that had shaped culture for millennia. Historical scholarship shows that this revival does not represent the creation of something new in response to modern identity politics. It reflects long-standing efforts to protect knowledge during periods of suppression and to bring it forward when conditions allowed. The revival, therefore, has archaeological depth. Hidden practices, whispered languages, and quietly maintained kinship structures form the bedrock on which contemporary resurgence is built. The modern visibility of these traditions is the final stage of a long process of endurance. This realization reframes the narrative often told about indigenous cultures in the colonial era. Instead of focusing solely on loss, it highlights continuity maintained through deliberate guardianship. Anthropologists studying these revivals observe that communities view their work not as restoring what was broken, but as remembering what was always present. Memory becomes an active force, bringing forward the threads that connect past and present. Even the legal recognition of land rights becomes part of this remembering. When native title is returned, it is not seen as the granting of new rights, but as the acknowledgement of ancient ones. There is also a generational shift underway. Younger Indigenous people, many of whom grew up speaking English as their first language and navigating both Indigenous and non-Indigenous educational systems, now play crucial roles in cultural renewal. They act as translators between worlds, carrying ancestral knowledge forward while also engaging with modern institutions. Their work in environmental management, linguistics, digital archiving, and education forms a bridge that allows ancient knowledge to move into new contexts. The continuity they embody is dynamic, not static. At the same time, elders remain central. Their authority is not symbolic. They are the carriers of memory. The individuals who held knowledge through eras when expressing it publicly could be punished. Revival depends on their guidance. Scholars emphasize that timing is critical, as many elders are among the last fluent knowledge holders for certain languages or ceremonial systems. The urgency of their teaching has inspired accelerated documentation efforts. Recordings of their stories, songs, and genealogical knowledge form archives that future generations can draw from. These archives do not replace living transmission, but they support it, offering a foundation on which revitalization programs can build. The archaeology of this revival extends beyond material sites. It includes the reconstruction of genealogies interrupted by displacement, the mapping of kin networks fractured by mission policies, and the retelling of histories that were denied or rewritten during the colonial period. Some communities now maintain extensive family trees reaching back through multiple eras, integrating oral testimony with archival records. These genealogies restore lines of descent that reaffirm the continuity of clans, skin groups, and responsibilities tied to particular stretches of country. Realization comes quietly. Restoration is not reconstruction. It is a remembering, a rethreading of lines never fully broken. The modern revival is not a cultural renaissance imposed from outside. It is the natural expansion of knowledge that endured in quiet places. A culture shaped across 50 millennia was never lost. It was carried through the hardest years by individuals who refused to let the story fade. Transition. And from these restored threads emerges the true question of this story. Imagine this. A culture older than the coastlines that frame it, older than the deserts that now define its centre, older even than the stars as they appear in their present positions. A culture so ancient that its earliest memories describe worlds geologists only rediscovered with sonar. Now imagine asking a simple question of something this old. Why are you still here? Why does this culture endure when so many others vanished before written memory began? The evidence suggests an answer that is neither mystical nor triumphant. It lies instead in a structure of knowledge so interwoven with land, law, ancestry, and time that continuity becomes the natural state, not the exception. We do not know for certain when the first threads of this continuity were spun. Archaeology offers dates, ancient hearths, and scattered pigments, microliths worn down by hands long gone, occupation layers older than most civilizations can imagine. But dates alone do not explain endurance. What persists through 50 millennia is not a fossil record but a world view. At the heart of that worldview is a simple principle. Knowledge belongs to the land as much as to the people. Cultural transmission anchored not in documents but in country itself. Each ridge, each creek, each outcrop and dune functions as a mnemonic device. stories attach to features with such precision that to walk the land is to walk through a library older than writing. When a story is stored in place rather than on parchment, it becomes resistant to erasure. Remove the parchment and the story is gone. Remove the people and the land still waits, holding the memory in its form. Kinship is the next pillar in this architecture of endurance. Aboriginal kinship systems form some of the most intricate and stable social frameworks on Earth. They regulate marriage, responsibility, teaching, and ceremony with a clarity preserved over thousands of years. Anthropologists studying these systems in the 19th and 20th centuries of the Common Era documented rules of such consistency that they seemed almost mathematical. These rules provided not only order but resilience. When populations were strained by drought or disease long before colonization, kinship obligations ensured redistribution, support, and continuity. When small groups fragmented or migrated, the system allowed them to reintegrate without losing identity. Kinship was not an accessory to culture. It was the structure that carried memory across generations. Ceremonial cycles formed the third anchor. Unlike written traditions that rely on fixed texts, ceremonial knowledge renews itself through enactment. Songs sung at the right time, movements repeated precisely, body painting mapped in patterns recalling ancestral journeys. Each cycle acts as both performance and archive. When elders teach younger generations, they transmit not just stories but timing, posture, rhythm, and the deep scaffolding of lore embedded within each sequence. Archaeologists analysing rock art sites have noted stylistic continuities across enormous stretches of time. These continuities are not accidental. They reflect ceremonial knowledge stabilised across generations through repetition. Ceremony is not preserved because people remember it. People remember it because ceremony requires them to. Ecological practice also shaped continuity. While many societies across the world experience collapse through overuse of their environments, Aboriginal ecological systems maintain sustainability across tens of millennia. Fire management, selective harvesting, seasonal mobility, and plant detoxification techniques ensured that populations remained stable without exhausting the landscape. Archaeological evidence shows relatively consistent population densities across long intervals, suggesting that the pressure of human presence on ecosystems remained balanced. When populations rise slowly and landscapes remain healthy, continuity becomes easier. There is no ecological cliff to fall from. But among all these foundations, perhaps the most powerful is the cosmology itself. The dreaming does not treat time as a line that recedes behind us. It presents time as a continuous presence, the everywhen, a term coined by anthropologists to capture the reality that ancestral events are not consigned to the past. They remain active, shaping the land in the present. When cosmology keeps past, present, and future braided together, forgetting becomes difficult. No single generation carries the burden of memory alone. Every moment, every place, every relationship participates in remembrance. This dissolves the fragility that affects document-based cultures, where a burned archive or a lost library can erase centuries. Here, memory is ambient. It exists in ritual, in kinship, in country, in night sky, in food gathering, in the simple act of naming a place with its true name. These elements, land-based knowledge, stable kinship, ceremonial cycles, ecological balance, and a cosmology where time itself breathes, form a self-reinforcing system. Each strengthens the others. Even when one thread is strained, the rest hold. This is why disruptions that elsewhere would have caused collapse did not unravel the whole. Climatic shifts, rising seas, megafaunal extinctions internal migrations, and later the violent ruptures of colonization, none of these erased the structure entirely. They altered it, wounded it, sometimes silenced it, but they did not destroy its underlying architecture. Archaeology shows that in many parts of the world, cultures rose and vanished along the trajectories of scarcity, warfare, or environmental mismanagement. Written knowledge proved brittle. Political systems fractured. Landscapes eroded. But in Australia, the interplay between people and land followed a different logic. Sustainability was not a moral choice, but a cosmological one. To damage the land was to breach relationship. To breach relationship was to breach law. And when law is intergenerational, carried in ceremony, enforced through kinship and articulated through the landscape itself, it becomes extremely difficult to lose. We do not need to romanticize this endurance to recognize its uniqueness. The archaeological record shows conflict, adaptation, change, and the long processes of cultural evolution. No society remains static across 50 millennia, but the core principles endured because they were distributed across every layer of existence. They were not texts to be memorized, they were worlds to be lived. And so the realization emerges with the same quiet clarity found in the oldest stories. The most ancient living culture did not endure because it resisted change. It endured because it understood that everything is connected. Ancestors and land, memory and law, ceremony and identity, the past and the present, the tides and the stars. Continuity was not the avoidance of transformation. It was the art of transforming without losing self. And so we end, not with a conclusion, but with the quiet recognition that endurance is a form of knowledge. Final existential promise. Across 50 millennia, what endured was not a people alone, but a way of remembering the world.